welcome to W5 News at 5. I'm Chris Weber. Tonight we are going to look back at the Suez Canal crisis and how it impacts Canada's identity. For those of you that don't know, the Suez Canal crisis took place during 1956 and 1957, involving ownership of the Suez Canal, which runs along the borders between Egypt and the Middle East. Countries involved in the crisis were Egypt on one side and Britain, France, and Israel on the other. The crisis started because Britain and France decided to stop the funding for the Aswan Dam because Egyptian President Nasser openly recognized Egypt's ties to communist countries such as the USSR and China. So in retaliation for France and Britain stopping the funds for the dam, President Nasser decided to deliberately sink 40 ships at the entrance to the canal, making it impossible to ship goods through. This meant ships wanting to ship goods through the canal would have to sail all the way around Africa, which was very costly in time and money. In retaliation for closing the canal, Britain, France, and Israel decided to invade Egypt and try to retain control. On one side, the British, French, and Israelis, all capitalist governments, and on the other side, Egypt, who has ties to the USSR, a communist government, so the threat of a nuclear war was very possible. Rush B. Pearson, a Canadian diplomat, first proposed a solution to defuse the tension between the two sides. Pearson created the United Nations Emergency Force, which is a peacekeeping force, and mobilized them into Egypt. His plan had the armies of Israel, Britain, and France withdraw immediately from the area because Pearson inserted peacekeepers instead of soldiers, and had the armies of France, Britain, and Israel withdraw immediately. This eased the tension between the two sides of the Suez crisis, as well as the threat of a nuclear war occurring. Some background to the crisis. But how did this shape Canada's identity, you ask? Well, let's do our signature dissection of the story using the 5 W's. Who was it that came up with the concept of peacekeeping and introduced as the solution to the crisis? It was Canadian Lester B. Pearson, the Secretary of State for External Affairs, who was born right here in Toronto, Ontario. He ended up winning a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the crisis. What did Pearson do to ease the tension? Pearson inserted a United Nations force large enough to keep the borders involved at peace while a political settlement was made. This meant he had to force the armies of Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw from the area. When did Pearson come up with this plan? Over 4 hectic sleepless days and nights, he created the world's first international peacekeeping plan, and he announced it in the early hours of November 4th, 1956. Where did Pearson's first peacekeeping strategy get implemented? Pearson created the United Nations Emergency Force at the United Nations and used it in Egypt to defuse the tension. Why? Why is Pearson's creation important to Canadian identity? Pearson's creation of the United Nations Emergency Force is important to Canadian identity because it establishes Canada's identity as a peacekeeping nation. To date, Canada has been involved in every major peacekeeping operation in the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. Pearson's idea of sending peacekeeping forces into a war or conflict area in order to maintain a ceasefire until both sides can negotiate an agreement was adopted by the UN and is still used around the world today. To recap our program tonight, the most important international relations event for Canada identity is the 1956 Suez Canal crisis, which occurred during the Cold War and saw Egypt, who had ties to communist Soviet Union government, against capitalist governments of Israel, Britain, and France. Canadian Lester B. Pearson introduced the concept of peacekeeping to the United Nations as a means to maintain the dispute borders around the Suez Canal until a settlement could be worked out. This concept of peacekeeping continues to be used around the world and establishes Canada as a player in all major peacekeeping operations to this day. That concludes our program for this evening. Thank you for watching. Please join us next week when we talk about the evolution of life in Canada. I'm Chris Weber, and good night.